Now we're on Daf Chav Beis, Amid Beis. Masha Ein Kein Beitza. When it comes to Rosh Hashanah, although we can be lenient with regard to burying the dead and allow burying the dead on the second day of Rosh Hashanah, but not with regard to Beitza. Meaning, if the hen laid an egg on the first day of Rosh Hashanah, we're not allowed to move the egg or benefit from the egg on the second day of Rosh Hashanah. It means what we call Yomi Richta, that both days of Rosh Hashanah have one single Kedusha. With regard to other Yomim Tovim, if the egg was laid on the first day of Yontif, then we could allow the egg on the second day of Yontif with the Tnai of Mimonevshach, which means that if yesterday was Chol and today is Kodesh, then there's no Achana on Yontif for Yontif. It's a Achana of Chol for Yontif. And if on the other hand, yesterday was Yontif, today is Chol, and for sure I'm allowed to eat the Beitza. However, with regard to Rosh Hashanah, we're not going to allow the Beitza Shenolda Yontif, the Aleph, to be eaten on Beis because of the principle of Kedusha Achas and Yomi Richta, which you may recall at the beginning of Masechet Beitza, we discussed the fact that the witnesses once came very late after they had already brought the Tamid Shel Bein Arbayim, and the Levium had already sung the song of Chol, and if we accept the Eidim, then there's a kilkul because they sang the wrong song, the wrong shira on the karma. And therefore they established that this day will be Kodesh and tomorrow will be Kodesh. They refuse to accept the witnesses to be Makadesh the Chodesh. And that's called Yomi Richta. And therefore Beitza Shenolda B'Rishon Asura B'Sheni. Amalei Sameirma responds, I don't accept the sheet of Rava at the beginning of the Masechta that Rosh Hashanah is Yomi Richta. I accept the sheet in Ardai against Rava that both days of Rosh Hashanah have the identical status to 2 days of Yontif. It's not one Kedusha, but two Kedushos. It's not a Yomi Richta, but rather it's Sfeika Diyoma. And once I accept the principle of Sfeika Diyoma, then Beitza Shenolda Ba'alef Muteres Bebeis on the second day of Yontif. And if that be the case, then the second day of Rosh Hashanah is only a Derabanan because of the laws of Safek. And now I could rely on the Shita that even Sharanos Haguf, which is not directly Ochel Nefesh, is going to be Mutter. And that's why Neymar allowed Chol on the second day of Rosh Hashanah. And now we get a little bit of an insight into the logic of the Nardai. Umay Datoch. What is the reason why you want to tell me that those who are far away from the Bezdin of Yerushalayim would have to generate an Isser on the second day of Rosh Hashanah, and we have to be machmir with all the chumras of the first day of Rosh Hashanah on the second day of Rosh Hashanah? That only applies when they were, back in the day, when they were Makadesh the Chodesh al pi re'iyah, and those who would not know which day was Rosh Hashanah would have to observe 2 days of Rosh Hashanah as Kedusha Achas. Why? Because Dilma Ma'abri Le'eliel. Maybe the Eidim for Kiddush HaChodesh would show up on the first day of Rosh Hashanah in the Bezdin after the Mincha time. And that's called Kilkul HaLeviyim B'Shir. That's when there was a halacha of Kedusha Achas and Yomi Richta. But in our days, the story is totally different. Ha-Omar Rav Chinina bar Kahana mimos Ezra v'Elech lo matzinu el ma'ubar. We never found that El was a full month of 30 days, And therefore, even though they had established the takana that they would not accept Eidim after the mincha, it never actually happened. It was just a theoretical possibility. It was always the case that the Eidim came on day 30 before mincha, because we never found El to be ma'ubar. El is always a chaser. It's only 29 days. So we'd always get the Eidim on the day of the 30th, before mincha, and memela odespiku bezdin l'kaisha chosh tishrei bo bayom. Once Bezdin accepted the Eidim on that day, meaning the first day of Rosh Hashanah, they would establish that day as Rosh Chodesh, which means Aleph Tishrei Rosh Hashanah. So the first day of Rosh Hashanah was definitely on a Torah level the day of Rosh Hashanah. It was Kadosh B'Kedushas Rosh Hashanah. So this whole takana to be knowing 2 days of Kodesh, that never happened. The Rechokim from Bezdin, they didn't know exactly which day was Rosh Hashanah, and therefore they did both days misafek. And therefore, Beitza Shenolda Barishon Muteres B'Sheni, and therefore, Chol of Einayim is mutter on the second day of Rosh Hashanah, just like it's mutter on the second day of Yom Tov. The Mishnah says, Ein ofen pitim, gritzin, el rekikin, toner rabbanon, Beis Shammai omrim ein ofen, pas ova b'Pesach, u'beisil matirim. So there's something called a thick dough. And on Pesach, if you bake a thick dough, then we're afraid that the process of baking will take an extended period of time, and in the meantime, it might become chametz. Kama pas over. When Beis Hillel say that you're allowed to use a thick dough, what is the shear of a pas over? How large of a dough are you allowed to bake on Pesach, such that Beis Hillel are not afraid that it might become chametz? Omer Rav Huna tefach, up to a tefach, a handbreadth. Where does he know it from? Shekein motzinu belechem aponim tefach. There were 12 challahs that were placed on the shulchan in the heichal in the Beis Hamikdash every single Shabbos, as the Torah delineates it in Parshas Emor, Vayikra Perek Chav Daled, and those lechem aponim had to be matzah. They were not allowed to become chametz, because the Torah says at the very beginning of Vayikra, call a mincha asher takrivu l'Hashem lo teyasa chametz. Lechem aponim is included in that isur, as the Gemara derives in Menachos Nun Zayin. But yet, the shear of the thickness of each one of these doughs that were baked for the lechem aponim was a tefach, and that's derived in the Gemara in Sukkah Daf Hey from the pasuk lechem aponim. Ponim is not less than a tefach. So we see that if you have a dough and its thickness is a tefach, you can still protect it and guarantee that it won't become chametz. However, if the botzek is more than a tefach thick, then even Beis Hillel will prohibit afiyah, because he won't be able to successfully prevent it from becoming chametz. Maskif lo Rav Yosef raised the following objection to Rav Huna. How can you learn anything from lechem aponim, which had an ovia thickness of a tefach? There are many, many distinctions between what you do in your private house and what they did in preparing the lechem mishnah in the Beis Hamikdash. For example, im amru b'zrizim, yomru b'sheinam zrizim. Who was involved in the Beis Hamikdash in preparing the lechem aponim? It was the Kohanim who was zrizim. They were very meticulous and very careful. And the Gemara tells us in Masechet Yoma that they came from a family called Beis Garmo. They were experts. They knew exactly how to do this malacha, and they could supervise and be careful that it shouldn't become chametz. But if I allow such a thick dough, for Rachel in the kitchen here, there's no halachos reason here. We got to be careful about chametz. Furthermore, in Amru Mela, there are many, many requirements with regard to preparing the lechem haponim. It's a pasa mela. Mela means they did a lot of work on the dough, like any other mincha, and it requires what's called 300 shifos, where they take the hand and they rub it 300 times back and forth. It requires 500 beitos, where he knocks the dough with his fist and he digs his fingers into it. And not only that, it's a batzek that's made of chitim, and it is very kneaded very thoroughly. It's not going to become chametz. Yomru b'pashena mela. Can you derive any conclusions about your kitchen household batzek? Im amru b'eitzim yaveshim, yomru b'eitzim lachim. With regard to the baking of the lechem haponim, they used only dry wood. Any wood that went on to the maracha of the mizbeach was wood that was cut down during the summer months up to but not beyond the 15th of Av, because after the 15th of Av, the sun starts getting weaker and the logs become moist, and we're afraid that they might have tolaim, which would passel them for the mizbeach. And it's these dry pieces of wood that they would take for the afiyah of the migdash, including the lechem haponim. But what does that have to do? How can you derive conclusions by analogy to the eitzim lachim that are used in the households of the people who are baking bread? Im amru betanur cham. In the Beis Hamikdash, the ovens were constantly going. There was a tremendous amount of heat that was absorbed into the walls of the ovens in the Mikdash, where constantly they were baking menachos and they were roasting the meat of the kodshim. Is Yomer b'taner tzonen? When we have to give extra time in order to heat up the ovens in our home kitchens, in the meantime, the thick dough is going to rise and it'll become chametz. Im amru b'taner shel mateches, the oven in the Beis Hamikdash, which was a kli shares, and it would be makadesh the lechem haponim and the shtei lechem. We only use it from metals, not from earthenware, and that's a sugya Masechet Zvachim Adaf Tzadi Vav with regard to tanur shel mateches. The tanur shel mateches, a metal oven gets very, very hot, and it will prevent any chimut. Is Yomer b'tanur shel cheres in our home ovens, which are made of earthenware, and they're not so hot. How do we know that it's so? Because of all these kashas, the Gemara rejects Rav Huna, and it cannot be the Beis Hillel and Beit Shammai are arguing whether you're allowed to do afiyah b'Pesach with a matzah that has a thickness. The dough is a tefach thick. So what is the machlokas between Beis Hillel and Beit Shammai? Omer Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba she'elis es Rebbe b'yichud. When I was alone with Rebbe, I asked him, now, who is the Rebbe of Rabbi Yirmiyah? Manu, Rav. So we're talking about the Amora Rav. My pas ava, and Rav answered pas meruba. The machlokes between Beis Hillel and Beit Shammai is not about whether you're allowed to bake a pas of on Pesach. Everybody would agree that that's problematic. But are you allowed to bake on Pesach a number of different lechamim? You know, as Beit Shammai says, the Isser here that we're talking about has nothing to do with chimutz, with the problem of chametz, is because he's working overtime. he doesn't need so many loaves of bread for the yontif. He seems to be baking an extra surplus of bread for chol, and that you're not allowed to do. Beisila matir, because they hold like Rav Shimon Elazar, which we had back on Daf Yud Zayin, that the more bread you put into the oven, the better it is for the taste of the bread. So it's called Ochel Nefesh, Ika di Amri. Others have a different version. Omar Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba, Omar Rav, She'iltis es Rebbe biyichud umanu Rabbeinu HaKadosh. I asked Rabbi Yehuda Nasi himself, my pas ova, and he answered me pas meruba. So am I korule pas ova? Why does the Mishnah call it a pas ova? And the answer is mishum de nefisha belisha. He's trying to indicate that there's going to be a lot of kneading with a K, right? Kneading of the butzek. And it's like a pas ova in that sense. Or inami biasri daitana, maybe in a certain area, location, la pas meruba pas ova korolate. They used to use the term pas ova to refer to a pas meruba. Michti, the Gemara says, mishum de katarach tircha de lo tzarechu. The only reason why Beit Shammai prohibits this pas meruba is because you're working overtime for bread that you're not even going to need on Yontiv, is my area Pesach. I mean, the Beitza mentions that the machlokus is with regard to Pesach, implying that it's a chibutz problem. It might become leaven. Is afil b'shayom tovim nami? Enochinami tana biyom tov the Pesach. The Beitza was addressing the case of Pesach, so he mentions Pesach, but really it applies to every yontiv equal. Tanya nami hoch, you have a Beitza Beit Shammai omer remain ofen pas meruba yontiv. It doesn't say Pesach but yontiv. Now the Mishnah is going to enumerate 3 dinim where Rabbi Gamliel was makil against the Chachamim. Afu Omar Shlosha Dvarim Lahakel. Number 1, his kula was Mechabdin Beis Hamitos. In the bedrooms, he allowed sweeping the floor on Yontif. Normally, we would prohibit it in other rooms of the house, because he's going to be mashve gumos, he's going to flatten out the ground inevitably when he does the sweeping, and that's a violation of Meleches Boneh. But in the Beis Hamitos, it's a place which is very small, it's a small bedroom, and they sweep it out on a daily basis so that it shouldn't be smoke, it shouldn't be dust that comes up around the people who want to sleep. So therefore, since they sweep it on a daily basis, we don't have to worry about mashpeh gumos. You're allowed to burn incense on Yontif. And Rav Gamliel allows this because he holds that this malacha is l'tzorech hanas haguf, and therefore it's considered meleches ochel nefesh, and it's mutar on Yontif. Thirdly, the osim gdima kulas b'leilei psachim, that Rabbi Gamliel was all in favor of a zecher lekorban Pesach, that they should roast the meat for the night of Pesach in the same identical way that they used to roast back in the day when the Mikdash stood the korban Pesach. And that's called Gedi Makulos, which means that they took the animal as it were, a whole animal, they put a spit through it, and they created sli. Sli means roasted. And whatever was inside, the bnei me'ayim, or the legs, that they would attach to the side. Anyway, this was what they did for the korban Pesach in order to fulfill the mitzvah of tzli eish. And the Torah there says, Rosh al Krov al Kirbo in Parashas Bo. And they did it on Leil Pesach. The Chacham were not happy in any of these 3 cases. They weren't excited about allowing you to sweep up your bedroom because you might come to sweep up the other rooms in your house and violate Meleches Boneh. They weren't happy about burning incense because they held that who likes incense? Only mifunakim, only exceptional people. It's not Shavuot L'chol Nefesh. And they don't allow preparing your meat for the night of Pesach in the same way that you would have done it if the Mikdash stood, because it's going to look like he's eating kodshim outside the Beis Hamikdash. Amar Avasi, machlokes legamer. Now, what does the word legamer mean? Legamer means what they used to do is they used to hang clothing or vessels on top of coals, and they would put incense on the coals, and that would give a very fragrant odor into the clothes that was suspended on top of the gecholim, or the utensils that were suspended on top. And that's going to be a machlokes between Rabbi Gamliel and the Chacham. Avol la riach kol mutter. The Chacham would agree that if you just burn incense in order to enjoy the smell and the fragrance, that's mutter. That's certainly considered anos haguf. But if he's only doing it for the purpose of the begadim, which is called legamer, that's not ochel nefesh, and that's why the Chacham objected to it. And Rabbi Gamliel was matir it, and apparently he considered it similar enough to ochel nefesh, and we'll have to see exactly why. Meisvei, the Gemara says the following: it cannot be that Ravasi is correct. The Beitza says, Ein mechabdin beis amitos biyontiv v'shel beis Rabbi Gamliel mechabdin. Omer Rabbi Eliezer Rab Tzadok, ha'omim harbi nechnasti achar abba. I went with my father Tzadok and visited beis Rabbi Gamliel on Yontiv. They would avoid sweeping even the bedroom on Yontiv. When did they sweep the bedroom or any other room? And in order to guarantee that there wouldn't be dust that would come up from the ground, they would cover the ground with sheets. And lemachar, and on Yontiv, when the guests came in, because this was Rabbi Gamliel, he was the Nasi, so many guests would come to join him in the great Yontif festivities and banquet. Then they would remove the stinim, and therefore the floor was clean. Not a bad idea, by the way. We should probably imitate this method today. Amru lo, so they said to Rabbi Eliezer Tzadok, Im Kain, if you're right that Rabbi Gamliel would not allow kibud on Yontif, and the Chachamim didn't argue with Rabbi Gamliel. After Shabbos, mutalasos came, and even on Shabbos you'd be allowed to do this. So where is the machlokes Chachamim and Rabbi Gamliel? It must be that Rabbi Gamliel allowed sweeping on Yontif itself. A very similar case now. Ein menichem es hamugmar b'Yontif shall base Rabbi Gamliel menichem. Amar Rabbi Eliezer of Tzadok, Pa'amim harbe nechnasti achar abel base Rabbi Gamliel. V'lo ayu menichem es hamugmar b'Yontif el meviim ardaskaos shall barzel ma'ashnin osa me'erev Yontif u'pokikin nikveim me'erev Yontif u'lamachak che ha'orchim nichnasim pochsim poschim. So according to the testimony of Rabbi Eliezer bar Tzadok, Rabbi Gamliel never allowed mugmar on Yontif. What they did is they set up these shovels that had holes in them, made of steel, on Erev Yontif, and then underneath these shovels, that were metal shovels that had holes in them, they would burn the incense, and then on Erev Yontif, they would close the holes, stop them up, and then Lemachar, on Yontif, when the Orchim came in to participate in the great festivities at the table of Rabbi Gamliel, they would open up these closures, and all the great fragrance would come out. That's how Rabbi Eliezer of Tzadok understood what was going on in the house of Rabbi Gamliel. So Gemara says it can't be. In pain after Shabbos mutalasus came. Why would the Chacham have disagreed with Rabbi Gamliel? There's no problem here in doing and setting this up on Erev Yontif. In any event, we see from this Beitza that machlokas between Rabbi Gamliel and the Chachamim is about putting incense on the fire on Yom Tov in order to generate this wonderful fragrance. Had nothing to do with the budding. It wasn't that they were trying to, give a fragrant odor to the garments. Because again, the whole story is about the orchim, that the orchim should come into the house of Gamliel and enjoy the benefit of the smell of the mugmar. And the Chachamim nevertheless prohibited it. And according to Rabbi Eliezer ben Tzadok, even Rabbi Gamliel prohibited. But anyway, it's against Rav Asi. Rav Asi claimed that everybody agrees that you're allowed to put mugmar on the fire on Yom Tov in order to smell the beautiful fragrance of the incense. Eli Yitmar Hachi Yitmar. So Gemara now reframes the statement of Rav Asi. Rav Asi, machlokes lehariach, avul legamer osur. The machlokes is about whether you're allowed to burn incense in order for people to enjoy the smell of the incense. Tanakama of the Beitza, again, who disagrees with Rabbi Elazar Reb Tzadok, he says that any malach that's the tzorach hanas haguf is mutter on Yom Tov, whereas, so that's from Gamliel, and the Chachamim say, no, this is not the hana that's considered shavel chol nefesh. Only the mefunakim appreciate that incense. I don't know if you've ever gone into a store that sells incense. I walk into such a store, I walk right out. I don't know, I can't. But many people love that smell. I guess it's an acquired taste, like dry wine or something. I don't know. But in any event, the Chachamim prohibit it, and Rabbi Gamliel permits it. And he says that anybody could theoretically enjoy the benefit of the smell of the incense. However, legamer boas hagodim masakelim is even Rabbi Gamliel would prohibit it because that's not called l'tzorach hanos haguf. Iboilu mauli ashen. Are you allowed to burn incense on Yom Tov for the purpose of improving the smell, the fragrance of peros, of fruits? They used to have dried fruits like figs and dates and chestnuts, and they would put it on top of some sort of a perforated mat, which was on top, held up by pegs. And then underneath the mat, they would burn gecholim, that's coals. And then on top of the coals, they would put the incense. And then the bosem, the fragrant smell would go up through the perforations into the peros. Is here we have machlokes amoraim if you're allowed to do this on Yom Tov. Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba Omar Rav also, you're not allowed to do this because this is only for mefunakim. An instant is somebody would enjoy the extra smell of the peros. But Shmuel Amamuta, Shmuel says that everybody would do this. Again, the poor people couldn't afford it, but everybody would appreciate, like you have venison, right? So you're allowed to shecht a deer on Yom Tov, even though, maybe you and I wouldn't be able to afford a deer. But nevertheless, everybody could theoretically enjoy the venison meat. Rav Huda Amar Os Mipnei She Mechab. Because when you put the bosem, this incense on top of the hot coals, it inevitably cools off to some extent the coals, and then the fire goes up. Why do you have to mention Melecha Es Mechaber? Why don't you just emphasize Mavir, that you're lighting a fire? Because simply in sequence, first it extinguishes partially the gecholim, the coals, and then the fire goes up. So I mentioned extinguishing first. Rabbi Yehuda al gabi gacheles asur, and he says that ishun, getting this beautiful fragrant smell into the peros is also because I agree with the Shita of Rav and Rav Huna against Shmuel. And we'll see Rava later on, that this is not Shavel Chol Nefesh, only very few Mefunakim would enjoy the benefit of those smells. Okay, then. So here we are on the top of Gimel Amud Aleph, and Amir Hashem will cover that tomorrow. And